Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to MAMP Connects. My name is Jennifer Hutchins. I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Association of Nonprofits, and it is great to see you all today. We have an exciting program. Um, we here at MAMP, and I've been talking about it for several months now, either in emails to you or other MAMP Connects about what a challenging environment it is for nonprofit leaders. It certainly feels like it's been like that. I mean, it's always a challenge working in the nonprofit sector, and then in particular in 2020 with the pandemic and all of the changes that we've all had to make with regards to the way we operate, but also many of us were on the front lines of dealing with some exceptionally challenging times for people in our communities. And things really haven't settled down since. And then, in particular, last year, where we've seen federal executive orders and actions that are creating serious funding, either cuts or just various uncertainty, which is making very difficult for all of us to operate professionally and plan ahead for what may come, as well as targets to diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, and just complicated contracting in general has made leadership, in particular at nonprofits right now, very, very challenging. And it's really putting a lot of strain on nonprofit staff because there are communities that are and missions that are feeling directly targeted. So the fear that has been augmenting, the morale that is being strained, and then just the added operational and financial challenges that are really putting our nonprofit staff and leaders in particular in very, very difficult situations. And so we wanted to bring the TSNE Leadership New England report to all of you because TSNE is based in Boston. They are a national capacity building organization. They consider themselves partners in social change. I encourage you to check out their services. And they do really important work helping us understand the conditions that we are working in. And I'm particularly excited about this report, and I'm going to introduce you to the editor and author of that report in just a minute. But I'm particularly interested about this one because they conducted several. They talked to a lot of leaders across New England, and this report is replete with actionable steps. And I think right now, in a time when we're feeling all very, many of us are under so much strain, taking action is one way we can move forward with um, some of the energy that might be building up for us. So the question really is, given all of this circumstance that we face us in, how do we move forward? What are the steps that we can take? And the more of us that do it together, the more energized that we can do if we do it as a group and we can support one another in this work. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Michael Ibrahim. He is the Chief Program and Impact Officer at TSNE. And Michael runs all of the national programs for TSNE and has exceptional amount of experience in all kinds of issues related to nonprofit management. He's on the graduate school faculties of both Boston University and the University of Kentucky. I'm delighted to invite Michael to speak with us this morning. It's been such a delight getting to know you and your team at TSNE, Michael. Thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure, Jennifer. And thank you, everyone, for coming to our conversation today. Before I kind of start a little bit, I just wanted to just thank Jennifer and everyone at MAM for inviting TSNE to talk about this research that we've created. This is actually the first public webinar or conversation that we have done around Leadership New England. So we wanted to do it here first with Maine. So thank you for inviting me. Just real quick, I would love to just talk really quick about TSNE. As Jennifer mentioned, TSNE is a capacity builder. We're also a fiscal sponsor. We do a lot of consulting and training work, and we own and operate the nonprofit center in Boston. So really looking holistically about how we can support the sector. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. Well, let's dive right in. As you know, you've been introduced to the MAMP Connects format, and we've been doing these since April of 2020. And our commitment to our audience is that we'll get them out of here at 9:45 so they can get on with their busy nonprofit day. Um, I'm really curious first about asking you about how you messaged this particular report, especially given the political environment that we are in today. And if you talked about that at all, or was it just another year at TSNE and and launching this Leadership New England report, which I should say, and please mention that this is a report you have done in the past.
That's right. So it is not another year for any of us. I think we can all agree on that. So a little bit of story. TSNE, this is the second edition of Leadership New England. We did our first one in 2014. So this is a follow-up report. And we were really curious on what had shifted in that intermediary 10 years. And that initial report really pointed to the underinvestment in the sector, leadership transitions that were on the horizon, and some philanthropic recommendations to support the sector. What we found this time around was those things have not changed despite 10 years of capacity building and a lot of investment into the sector. They persist, and they are actually a cause of the downstream challenges that we're seeing is the chronic lack of investment in our work. And so what we wanted to take this time around, just the setup for this was we wanted to be a bit more expansive. We knew what we were facing in our environment politically, and also the compounded challenge. You had mentioned COVID and a lot of isolation that was happening and challenges that we're facing. The previous research and we did a big literature review, so you'll be able to see everything there. What we found there was a gap in the literature, which was most of the conversations center with senior leaders. So folks who have been in their role for 10 years, executive director level. That's one piece of information. But what we were really curious about was, so we were looking at pathways. We're looking at the sector and where we're going to go from here, because we need to rebuild after where we are, and we need to rebuild better. And it's going to take some time to do that. So to be able to understand folks at their early and mid-career stages in nonprofit leadership, what is really important to them, to be able to infuse that information in that historic rebuilding that we're going to have to be doing for our sector was really critical. So in addition to the literature review, we also assembled a number of focus groups from all over New England. We looked at different roles, different disciplines, and however folks identified as a leader, to be honest. And so what we were able to do was to get in conversation with early career leaders, with mid-career leaders and senior career leaders to best understand what was the challenges they were facing, what were some opportunities that they were presented with them, but also think about amplifying their voice. So you'll see in the report, we use quotes a lot. We use testimonials. Folks have been felt unheard and silenced. This is part of the political environment that we're in. So we want to take the opportunity to really amplify their voices in this. So that's how we look at this report. Is also seeing where we were 10 years ago, but having a platform to amplify the voices of our leaders throughout New England. So right now, in the political environment, to your question, Jennifer, this is the hardest time to be a leader, to be a nonprofit leader. That was universal across all of our focus groups. There is a lack of funding. A lot of grants are being taken away. There's attacks on the nonprofit sector almost every day. And overall trust in nonprofits are at record lows. The National Council of Nonprofits actually just reported some information around there. But yet, the services that we require, that we deliver, are critical, and they're essential to the work. And we can do things that government can't do. We can do things that for-profit can't do. And so investment in our work and the sustainability of our sector and our people is critical. So that's the messaging that we have right now, that we are doing things that no one else can do, and at the same time confronting a lot of the challenges that are being presented to us. So supporting infrastructure, relationships, and being honest about the challenges that have come in since January 20th, 2025 that have been compounded since then. There is a quote from one of our leaders I just wanted to share that they said, starting on that date, added 20% to their workload. And so now they're just concerned about maintaining their 501(c)(3) status and trying to keep the compliance and the regulatory and navigating all of the noise that's out there, but still delivering essential services to their community. So the pressures on leaders to navigate all of this has only has added up since then.
I really appreciate that, Michael. And I just want to emphasize that more because just hearing you talk now made me realize the weight of the importance of this report because it really is doing so much more than presenting actionable items, steps for us to take in the sector to support our leaders. It's also it is a really important testimony that needs to get out there because as you mentioned, the National Council, both the leader of TSNE, Elaine Ng, and I sit on the board of the National Council of Nonprofits, and we're seeing every day these falsehoods that are being spread in the media about nonprofits. And so I just want to elevate that a little more, is that reports like these are really critical to helping us even begin to stem the tide of negative false information that's coming out about the sector. So I just want to elevate that and thank you for that because it has its explicit purpose of helping us understand how we can support the sector, but it's so much more than that in terms of being a demonstration of what's going on to external folks that can really see the true nature of what we do. So thank you for that. Question though is I also really appreciate both the pathways theme that you all picked up on, as well as recognizing how important it is to hear from all kinds of people working in the nonprofit sector, not just those who might be senior leaders who have quote unquote years of experience. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what differences, important experiences and differences that you might have seen through the focus groups that would be useful?
Yeah, I love this question. And it was really at the center when we decided not to do a widespread survey because there's so much surveying out there and there's a lot of research. We wanted to really drill down to this. And so this is where we started asking questions about the political environment as well. So we had an opportunity to be responsive in this. So when we were able to do this, we were looking at a targeted sense of questions for kind of each career stage. And our early careers usually in their leadership 1 to 5 years. So they're just really in here starting it, not quite sure that this is for them given their experiences. And so our early career leaders really talked about burnout and wellness and work-life balance as non-negotiables. So if they were going to commit to this work, then the work needed to be able to be doable for them. And so we talk in the report a little bit about traditional training programs are getting people ready for the sector, but it's actually getting the sector ready for folks to be leaders in that and really deconstructing what that means. And so this is really telling the story of like, it's great that you all did this years ago. I'm not doing 80 hours a week. I need balance. I need to be able to have wellness and take sick days and PTO and things like that. And so if I am going to survive in this work, which has historically low compensation and high stress, it has to have some wellness factors in there as well. So early career leaders were universal in that structure. Mid-career leaders had what came up to be some of the hardest challenges. These are folks at 5 to 10 years in leadership. Again, leadership being a broad term of self-identifying. So now we're getting to more folks who are in executive roles, because leaders could be program directors, program managers. These folks were feeling really isolated. So leadership isolation became a major theme in those conversations. These people came to leadership right before the pandemic, where things were locked down, and actually funders stopped funding convenings and gatherings and networking, and had just to get money out the door to keep organizations going on. But what we saw there was a downstream effect from those connection points going away, people don't have their people anymore. And so it's really hard, as you all know, to be in a position where you just want to talk through your situation, and it's hard to talk to your board or your staff, and you're feeling very alone in your work. And so there was a real need for community to be able to share the experiences and just have a sounding board of other leaders at that similar stage to offer advice and connect. And so one of the recommendations for that we have for philanthropy is to fund those networks, bring those convenings back, to be able to bring people together in a cohort environment or in other networking events in order to bring that sense of belonging together at mid-career leaders. One of our quotes from our mid-career leader was, "I feel like I'm a wartime executive director, to be honest. Like, I had to deal with the pandemic." And then I had to deal with the tax on equity in our organization. And now we've got the political environment. Wouldn't it be a dream if I could just predict 1 year budget? Wouldn't that be just a dream if I could project and be able to do a strategic plan like in the old days kind of thing? There's just not that luxury anymore. And so to be able to rely and build networks to be able to lean on each other, they don't have that. There's a huge gap there. And moving to our senior leaders who do have a lot of those networks because it's been built over years, that wasn't so much a theme. But what was a challenge with those folks was when is the time to go? When is the time to retire and the knowledge transfer around that? A lot of the folks were honest and said, we don't have retirement, we don't have savings, there's chronic underinvestment in our sector. And so we're not here because we love the work. We're here because we have to be here financially to survive and support a family. And so that struggle with we know we should be doing these leadership transition strategies and sharing our networks with up and coming leaders and doing all that, but yet I don't have a choice. And so mid-career leaders are feeling stuck. They're feeling at a place of helping to tell the senior leaders it might be time to go, but that's awkward. But then they can't fully step into the leadership roles as well. So there's a friction that's happening there too. And so our early and mid-career leaders were talking about the need to have open and honest conversations around succession planning and having opportunities to grow into leadership, to take on responsibility, to stretch into specific work, be invited and shared networks with board members or funders, but then senior leaders hanging on because of necessity.
Yeah. Yeah. Such important stuff. And I can relate to some of that. It's really important. Um, and your report mentions unique challenges that are faced by people of color in these positions. Can you talk a little bit about what your report elevates there?
Yeah, and so there's also some really dynamic quotes that are in the report too. So I invite everybody to read exactly what some of our leaders are saying directly. So a lot of the report, a lot of the conversations that we had, particularly of leaders of color, were that they felt in some workplaces bullied. They felt that all the pressures of this organization, its structural deficits, its challenge to achieve impact, were all sitting on their shoulders with little support. They were feeling that they weren't being invited to networks, and the boards, particularly if they were white-led boards, were not offering up those networks or opening the connections. And so they felt sabotaged from the very beginning of the work, and the burnout was the highest in their conversations. And so what our report talks about is really looking at how do we shift culture? How do we share power? How is power held and shared in order to really support our leaders, to really look at the organizational culture that needs to be reframed, to dress, to really be named, and then work hard before you bring in our leaders into that space. A lot of our folks were first time leaders of color at a historically white led organization. And so they had a lot of challenges that surfaced during their time. It wasn't explicit, it was implicit. And so they were struggling with, and during the interview in the first couple months of a honeymoon period of saying, yes, we support equity, we support leaders of color, but then when work presented itself to actually make some tough choices and for the boards to step up in certain ways, they were feeling some barriers, like I said, about networks. They weren't given that. They weren't given the support or the coaching that might have been necessary for them to really thrive. And so they were feeling like this is performative. You say you want a leader of color in this, but you're not willing to do the hard work that's necessary to make this environment and look and really deeply internally into the culture of the organization for this to thrive. And so the burnout was some of the highest across the organization. So we have some recommendations for boards, for organizations to re-examine their organizational culture and their commitments to equity, to really support our leaders of color to thrive in their roles.
So great segue. But I'm going to pause for a second and just encourage people again. If you have any questions for Michael, I want to hear from, or even if there are areas, because he's touching on so many themes that we could have an entire program about each one, right? So if there's anything you want him to talk a little more about, I will be getting to questions that are coming up in just a few minutes. But now would be a really good time, Michael, for us to go into some of those specific recommendations because that I have to say, I love the whole report, but my favorite part was like a list of things to do. And so, in terms of how organizations can what can organizations do? And I'm going to challenge you a little bit because you put a lot of important emphasis on talking to philanthropy and funders about how they can support. But I can just imagine what some of my peers are thinking is, well, what if we don't have that funding? Is there anything that we can do that doesn't require extra funding? And so just kind of putting that extra element. But what are some of the ways that you are encouraging organizations to intentionally build out these pathways with equity as a core value?
Yeah. So thanks for that, Jennifer. I love being challenged around things. I will say we're never going to stop with philanthropy. So we'll come back to that because that drumbeat still needs to be had no matter what. So specifically, some of the things that came up that our leaders were saying, and this was directly from a lot of their recommendations, is um, really like what I said about being honest about stewarding thoughtful succession planning, being intentional about pathways, bringing people onto projects, really opening the doors that are often closed to them. We also are looking at wellness quite a bit in here. So I would invite organizations to really, as one leader said, what we do is deadly serious, but it doesn't mean that we need to be deadly serious on a day-to-day basis. So where are we finding joy? Where are we infusing that in the wellness? Because wellness is a huge part of this. And so really looking at the HR structures that organizations have and thinking of ways that to your point, may not need external funding like funding sabbaticals. Wouldn't that be nice? But there's also things about reframing sick time to be used as health time. Or one of our leaders was talking about how they ramp up in programs. And they have to swarm because their work is around that. A lot of it is around advocacy as well. But are you also planning for a reset? Do you come down from that pace? Do you give staff a minute to breathe? So you might have to assemble, and this person said swarm, which is, I love that term. But what are the mechanisms in place to have people take breaks to come back from that pace? Because a lot of times we swarm and we stay at that level indefinitely, and that causes the burnout. So being intentional to that. A lot of our leaders were talking about the importance of really modeling that kind of wellness behavior. So being transparent about saying, I'm taking a mental health break today, team. I invite you to do the same. Modeling from the top actually is a big part of our report when it comes to wellness. So there are things that leaders can do in that space in order to really make sure that this work is sustainable. And then from the smallest one, smallest area of just like something to think about, a couple executive directors were saying, offering gratitude, it's almost free, but it goes a long way to really build connections and to really show that folks are really valued for their work. So this one executive director, it's in the report, leaving small notes on a desk if you're actually in the office, or sending a Teams message and said, I just really appreciate what you're doing here. It's those small acts of gratitude that help reset when we're faced with all of these challenges that are out there and the attacks that we're facing, that internally we're building a different culture and being a part of that. So yeah, it would be great to have funding so you can take 3 months off to be able to unplug completely. We know that that's not possible for many organizations, but it's these other ways of showing up and building a culture of wellness within the organization that is possible. And many organizations are moving to that. So that's how we get to that balance. And going back again to our leaders, particularly early career leaders, this is the type of stuff that's non-negotiable for them to remain committed to this work.
Thanks, Michael. I will also mention, and I know this was mentioned in your report, MANP recently, a couple of years ago, came up with a compensation philosophy and public guidelines for how we set our pay. And I will say that it's really, I was skeptical. I've been at MANP for 10 years, and I admit, like, based on where I am in my career and the different eras that I've worked in, I was skeptical about the idea of making when you do a job, when you post a job, you actually say what the salary is. And I admit I was like skeptical because that's just not what you did, right? It was all about negotiating and da 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 da. I am so glad we've moved in the direction of just being transparent and being really, because it takes so much pressure off of me as a senior leader who is ultimately responsible for setting those types of decisions. I get to do it with my team, and it's transparent. And then MAMP, we actually shared with folks what that experience was like. And so, if just for the group, if you're interested in learning more about compensation philosophies, we have a little bit of information about that. And we also will be sending out a follow-up email with all the links that are mentioned in the chat today. So don't worry if you've missed any of them. But anyway, that's just one thing I wanted to elevate. So let's move on to, you mentioned philanthropy. We had a great question from the group asking if you and your team happen to have reached out to any board members in this conversation. Part of that question is then also, what role do you see funders and boards and peers playing in removing these barriers to pathways and supporting leaders of all kinds?
Yeah, I love this question. To the first question about board members, no, our survey, or excuse me, our focus group and our literature review didn't focus on boards. We really wanted to talk to leaders and be candid about their struggles. And a lot of folks felt struggled by their board and not supported and having to manage up and manage down. So we wanted to kind of get to that a little bit. Maybe our Leadership New England 2024 might do that, or maybe a follow-up piece. We'll see. Really thinking about philanthropy here, this was one of the key points in the 2014 report, and it remains to be a big part of this report. And so this is no surprise, and this is going to sound like, yeah, we've been talking about this for a while, so I'll just caveat that real quick, is trust-based philanthropy practices. So this is really reminding funders it can be done. You can do general unrestricted operating support. You can do multi-year grants. You, in fact, can pay indirect and full cost and fringe benefits for your grantees. And we saw that happen during the pandemic. We saw reporting requirements almost eliminated or extremely streamlined. We saw the application processes be refined a lot. But what we've seen in the last subsequent years is actually that's all been rebuilt again. And so applications are now quite a bit longer. There's multiple steps with interviews, the hoops that you have to jump through. If you can actually get the grant, let's just say the grant comes through and not revoked, like some of the federal grants have been. And so folks are just feeling unsupported and restrictions on indirect and things like that. So when I said philanthropy, we'll keep beating this drum because it's something that still needs to be, even though it's something that we've talked about for a while, investing in these processes. And then additionally, leadership development and wellness as new areas. So I want to raise up the Institute for Nonprofit Practice and the Building Movement Project, Urban Institute, independent sector. There's a lot of research around this about wellness and really getting past the scarcity mindset in philanthropy. And this is as critical as a balance sheet. This is as critical as a depreciation schedule for a facility to be able to invest in our workforce and the folks who are at the core of running our organizations and programs. Programs don't run themselves. They need humans to be able to do that. We're not in the AI robot stage. It's a very human process, and most of us are have to live proximity to the challenges that we're addressing. So that affects our compensation structure. And so for funders to not only recognize full cost of what it takes to run our organizations and programs and having flexible multi-year funding to do that, but also take a holistic beyond the check approach to that work. So it's great, write the check, but what else are you doing as a funder? And so we point to, again, bringing back convenings and networking and consultancies, getting out of the way. One of the conversations we've just recently had with a funder was accepting proposals written for other funders. Like, why do you need a separate application if it's about general operating or about a similar program? Like, why go through all of that work? Can you accept an application that's already pretty much the same that another foundation has already done? It saves so much time in that space. Co-writing applications with grantees had come up in a conversation that one of our leaders mentioned, where they just sat down for a 30-minute Zoom call with a program officer and they co-wrote the application because the program officer knew what needed to be answered in that application for it to go up. This was a family foundation. And so they believed in the work and they both were invested in making this a success. So where foundation can play an active or philanthropy can play an active part in making this happen, is requiring some real looking inward. Do we need to have that pendulum shift completely all the way back to extreme compliance? Can we be flexible with this? So this is why, even though it's stuff that any of us would talk about, having a space where we're amplifying that message and making sure the funders are re-examining that, particularly as philanthropy is going through their own leadership transitions, we would just want to make sure that that's pretty clear. For the board side of things, this is really it was surprising in our focus groups, although it might not be for everyone, that there's just a lack of feedback, support, professional development, and accountability. I think some of our leaders wanted that as well. And instead, micromanaging from boards. So this was boards really not understanding the role of management versus governance because there wasn't trust. And this is particularly with our leaders of color or new leaders coming into the position. There's not the trust that is there. So boards can tend to micromanage their leaders. And so this was again the crunch between the board and staff and really needing the support of what is governance and what is management and knowing where those two lines are to be able to be effective at the role. So there's some education that's in that, but also there is real support of, yes, your job is to hire and fire the executive director, but your job is also there to support that person. And what does that mean? And the coaching and support and executive coaching that might be there in order to really support this person in their position. Even just an annual review with feedback or a 360 review. That's something that we practice at TSNE to be able to really get some feedback to improve and have a plan, a personal development plan in front of them. And that's something that boards may not think is top of mind is to support their executive leader, but it absolutely is. And we do have a quote from a senior career leader in our report that boards should be training themselves in that. So that would be going to board development work to really understand that. So what does it really mean to onboard a leader of color? What does it really mean to support a leader through an annual review process and annual or ongoing feedback mechanisms, and not just fly in quarterly, tell the executive director what to do and fly out of there. So there's a real examination of a board assessment and real work that the board needs to do so that management and governance can both work together.
Yeah, that's great. There's so much in there, Michael. That's so helpful. Um, I want to spend the rest of our time addressing a couple of the questions that we've gotten in our chat. And one of them is taking a little bit deeper dive into what you've already talked about, which is, how do you maintain these pathways when we're under such constraint, right? And the senior, like you said, the senior leaders who feel like they can't leave for personal issue, for personal financial issues potentially, but also because this last year the funding constraints are becoming so egregious. And then mid-career leaders who are getting frustrated, so they're leaving, and then you almost have this gap in the pathway between the early and the senior. And what are those retention mechanisms that can really support that career progression? And before you lean into that a little bit, I just want to say that, one of the ideas that I just had around, you were mentioning 360s that boards should consider for their senior leader, but also the importance of having those types of conversations with early career folks, people in pathways, and having really frank discussions about how can we support you through your leadership progression. Because sometimes I think, even, I'm just going to be very candid, like I make some assumptions about where our staff is in their leadership development. And when was the last time I really spent the time to sit down with them and talk to them about where they want to go and what do they need? So I'm just bringing that up, but I'll leave it to you. You're the expert.
By far the expert. And I also want to say I see a few folks from TSNE on the call. So I just want to shout out Owen Weitzman and Artie Maharaj, which were also key writers of this report. So thank you, Artie and Owen, for joining. I would
And
say
Kiara too. Hi,
and
Kiara.
Kiara, we see Kiara. Hi, everyone. One of the we could talk about this forever, but I'll be short and focus on one is the transparency of what's possible. So to have that, you just were talking about the conversations. A couple of our leaders said, "I don't even know if this is possible at my organization. I don't know what a
Mm.
promotion even looks like. I don't even know if that is." Possible or how you would go about doing that. So there's not an open conversation about pathways in general. That was one of the structural barriers that we identified. Yes, compensation has become more transparent in hiring, and that's wonderful. And we do that, and we should all do that. But then, how are we actually talking about moving up and through and having the inventory of what that looks like for each person? Because not everybody wants to do what you did. Not you, Jennifer, but as a leader of an organization, not everybody might want to go on that track that you might have had. And so to really understanding even at right off at the very beginning with our early career leaders, and that might shift depending on what they lean into and what they experience and what they grow in, but having some early conversations about what their journey might look like and what are being honest about what the opportunities are within the organization. And like I said, maybe financially not everyone can be a director level at an organization. However, are there projects that can really lean into skill development and growth? Is there opportunities to lead on campaigns, like a capital campaign? You might be doing a capital campaign. Does that give you a stretch opportunity for leadership in that specific time-bound moment? There are ways that you can map this through based on what the organization is going through. I just saw a question about strategic planning. That's a wonderful opportunity to be involved as someone who is not a senior leader in a strategic planning process. Actually, TSNE, we just finished, or we're at the very tail end of one. But the staff group that's a part of that is not just director levels or senior leaders. It really is cuts across through the organization. That if you're a part of strategic planning and talking about mission, vision, and values, and your theory of change and all that type of stuff, that on itself is a great skill builder, but then it needs a conversation. Where do we go from here? What does that pathway look like for me? What's possible? And just sitting down, and that could be done in a check-in on a small, basis, on a weekly check-in. That could be done on a little more formal process, maybe quarterly, of course, at the annual review process, and really setting, what we do at TSNE would set 5 goals for the next year. So then we can check in on ourselves. So we've got these 5 professional development or growth or leadership goals that the supervisor and the employee have really determined is gonna be the focus. What's the time and the investment and the checking in on that to make sure it happens? So that's the real intentionality behind it. So I just say to close, transparency of conversation,
Mm.
that is even possible within the organization. And then once those conversations are being had, what does that look like to build it out, and be honest about it?
And the one thing I would just add to that, Michael, is considering extra compensation. If you
Mhm.
do ask someone to take on extra work, is building in the opportunity in your transparent compensation philosophy, the opportunity to, if you actually take on added work, and it doesn't have to be thousands of dollars, just an acknowledgement, a financial acknowledgement that they are taking on extra work.
Yep.
Okay, so we are coming towards the end, but I do love this question. So I'm going to give you another challenge, 1 minute to answer the question about the person is curious about if you heard anything in your conversations about how people are approaching strategic planning any differently with regards to it being such an adaptive environment.
Yeah, I could talk about this for hours. How much time do we have? Okay, just a
You
minute.
have 1 minute.
Um, So, up until this point, I would even say, we do strategic plans at TSNE, and like I just said, we're at the tail end of ours. Even coming into this, the 3 to 5 year plan was old. Like that playbook, it's just not adaptable, and flexible to the challenges that we face on a daily basis. So I think most organizations, it didn't come up that much in our conversations, a little bit in the leadership pathway, but also our work at TSNE and what we were doing ourselves. It's more of strategic thinking, than it is strategic planning. And by that, I mean
Mm,
getting really clear and set on the mission, the values, the vision. It can roll really into communicating your value proposition as an organization, really understanding the business model of your organization, really working through the board through scenario planning because you don't know what might come. And there might be opportunities. At TSNE, we sometimes talk about external shocks. So that we could wake up one day and the IRS is examining 501(c)(3) status, for example. And as a fiscal sponsor, that's a really important issue that we are involved in. And so what is in front of us that we use as our North Star to help look at each scenario as they come to determine where to go. And so that scenario planning is bigger now than it probably would be than a usual strategic plan. And for a lot of organizations, the availability and reliability of data has become quite a bit like, how do we know? We can hear anecdotally, but how do you cut through the noise? So how do you know what some of the challenges are? So when we're faced with financially, we know this, but what does this mean from the impact or the outcome perspective? Because this is really critical work. It might need subsidy, it might need case making, but this work has to continue. The outcomes are so strong, or the impact of the work. And so mapping our mission and money access of programs have become more of that. So then we can make the decisions when we are faced with them. And then there's the conversation with the board about this is the process. We're not going to come for every decision. You need to trust management. And again, it's going back to the role of management versus governance and understanding the framework that's there, that management will have to go through as the stuff will come up from time to time. So I would say it's more about being nimble, more about having key drivers for the organization. We're just not going to be able to anticipate everything that comes to us. So we actually have backed off a little bit about some time bound outcomes. We want to get there, but we also don't want to be limited by some of that. And we want to take advantage, but we know that things are going to be coming at the same time. And so what's really clear is where we want to go, and be flexible with that as opposed to very specific time-bound, kind of artificially created milestones that may or may not happen.
Yeah, completely agree with you, Michael. Thank you so much. And I think I'm going to write down strategic thinking over strategic planning. I just think that's wonderful. I am going to have to close this today. Thank you again. Such great information. I'm really excited. We're going to send you all the links, folks. Michael also has an article that he wrote for candid.org, and we'll have a link to that. That can be a useful tool to share with your boards and your networks just to introduce folks to the report. So I'd encourage that. Thank you for coming. What's next? I'm super excited about is we're going to stick with these themes that have been identified in this report. And at our next MAMP Connects on April 17th, we have three leaders of color who are from Maine who are going to be joining us and telling us directly what their experience is. We've asked them to take a look at TSNE's report and let us know in their own words what their experience has been leading a nonprofit organization in Maine as a leader of color. And then we have other MAMP Connects that will be picking up on some of these themes in the future. I also just want to point out we have an event, a training on Thursday, April 9th from 1 to 2:30 about collaboration and the tools that you need to clarify roles and decisions. It's really a toolkit for how to do collaboration, which is also a very important thing when it comes to building and supporting leaders. So stay tuned to all this activity. Thank you all for coming. Thank you again, Michael. I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Yeah, great. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.